Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 4 of the Sharks Avalanche second round series, in which the Sharks lost 3-0. Now, the second time they have been shut out in these playoffs, twice in 11 games, both times in Game 4 of the first and second round series, and it's honestly not the worst look in the world. Of course, in the playoffs, it doesn't really matter if you lose 3-2 in quadruple overtime or 10-0. It still technically counts as a loss on the series, and you're supposed to sort of just move on past it. So it's, again, not the worst look, but it's also not a great look for a team that was, like the second or third best offensive team during the regular season. So hopefully the Sharks can get more consistent offense and not continue to be shut out, because, again, it wasn't necessarily a great goaltending performance here from Philip Grubauer that kept the Sharks off the board, which I'll get to a bit later. But this game did differ somewhat, I felt like, from the first three games, in which the Sharks played a pretty solid game. They could have technically won all three of those games, but the Avalanche made changes to their game. The Sharks had some things go differently in this one, but for the Avalanche, first, Coach Jared Bednar came to the realization that basically the entire universe came to maybe just a single game into this series, that Hey, you know those are three best players that we always put on the same line halfway through the game? Why don't we start the game with them on a line just already? Why would we even have to wait till halfway through the game to reunite it? Oh, wow, Bednar, what a great call there that you're able to do. Nobody could have come to that realization any quicker than Game 4 into this series. It's truly a Jack Adams type of maneuver here. But he finally decides to reunite these three players to actually start a game. They, of course, continue to give the Sharks trouble. They have great shifts every time they're on the ice, and they actually managed to get the first goal of this game. That would be Nathan MacKinnon, a player who basically everyone heard about, depending on, or no matter which broadcast you were watching on TV, you definitely heard them talk about Nathan MacKinnon a lot, and he scores this first goal. It was a nice goal, bats it out of the air with some hand-eye coordination. But also what Bednar did is that something that he didn't do in Game 3 for whatever reason is that he actually decided to match up his lines. I don't know if he underestimated the Sharks in Game 3, but he seemed pretty okay with just having that line up against the Couture line and exactly what DeBoer wanted. But in this game, he decided to focus a bit more on trying to get it out against, the fourth line, the third defensive pairing, the third line. And that did go to the benefit of the Avalanche, of course, in that regard, that they were able to get the uneven matchups, and I mean, we even saw it once, did they? He got it against the fourth line, and the fourth line, DeBoer wanted them to basically immediately switch off the ice to get the first line on, and they almost took a too many men on the ice penalty doing that. But for the Sharks, the main thing that changed wasn't the goaltending. The goaltending was quite good tonight as well. I'll get to that a bit later as well. And it wasn't really the defense. I thought the defense was at a pretty similar level than it has been for this entire series, honestly enough. Maybe similar to Game 3, Brent Burns was a bit off. His usual giveaways ended up actually punishing the team this time on a couple of times on both the Wilson and I think the MacKinnon one as well. So not a great night for Brent Burns, but otherwise it was rather solid, I felt. But it was the offense that really dropped the ball here for the San Jose Sharks. As I said, Grubauer didn't have to be that good in tonight's game. You could probably argue he had to make tougher saves in each of the first three games the Sharks played, because it felt like nobody really stepped up to do anything tonight. And that has been a bit of an issue. Again, that is something I will get to later, but the offense hasn't really worked out. So the Avalanche, who they weren't really that great here tonight. They got the goal from MacKinnon, they got a power play goal from Wilson, and then otherwise it was an empty netter from Erik Johnson. It was mostly, I felt like the Sharks lost this game more so than the Avalanche won it. First thing to talk about would be Martin Jones. As I said, the goaltending continued to be quite solid, and this was maybe his best game of this series thus far. Martin Jones has just been doing a great job at keeping the Avalanche off the board. A lot of the times the Avalanche are being kept to the perimeter by the defense, but this game in particular maybe had a few more defensive breakdowns than the three previous games, but Jones has just been doing a great job keeping those out of the net, on players like Soderberg, and of course Landeskog, MacKinnon, and Rantanen. Brassard, I think, had a good chance. Kerfoot, of course, had some good chances. And Martin Jones has been there the whole time. The 2 goals the Avalanche did score were mostly just sort of tips in front or good plays in front by Avalanche players that were not defended well enough by the Sharks in front. So tip by Landeskog, comes right to McKinnon after a Jones save, bats it in, and then the Wilson one, Rantanen fans on it, so Burns doesn't respond to it correctly. Rantanen, great pass to Wilson. So no chance on Jones for either of the 2 goals, and otherwise he made some really solid saves here tonight, and he continues to be a great player for the Sharks goaltending wise, and hopefully he will continue that way throughout the rest of the series. Of course, he will need to be that way if the Sharks want to win this one and win future series if they do make it. Next is Erik Karlsson, who I felt like has actually been quite good for this entire series thus far. He was obviously quite good offensively in that first series against the Golden Knights. I think he had like 9 assists, but his defensive game left a lot to be desired. I feel like, I don't know if he's gotten healthier in this series, if that's the case, or maybe he just learned to play through whatever he is dealing with a lot better, because he has been, similarly as strong defensively. I liked how he was jumping up in the offensive play a lot here tonight, even if the assists aren't following as much as they were in the first series. But he's also been quite strong defensively. There was maybe like one play where I felt like he was quite flat-footed. Luckily didn't get burned for that, but otherwise he was making a lot of solid defensive plays even when he was caught on the ice against the McKinnon line. So Karlsson has really stepped up here in this second series. I'd like to see the points actually start to rack up here for Erik Karlsson, because he's been getting the chances and they just haven't really been buried by him or the rest of the team. But I feel like eventually he will break through with all the great plays he is setting up. Onto the second and third line, and this is where the whole offensive dropping the ball does come into play, because I feel as though the first line for the majority of this series has actually been pretty good. I liked their first game. I thought their second game was pretty good as well. Obviously, Logan Couture took over the third game, and here tonight, while it's not saying much, they were probably the Sharks' best line. Meyer, Couture, Nyquist, they got a couple of good chances. It wasn't great, but it was probably still their best line, because the second and third line for the Sharks has been slacking for the majority of this series. I mean, the third line obviously had that game 1 where they were spectacular, but games 2, 3, and 4 have just not been good enough. I mean, I thought Thornton in particular tonight maybe had his worst games of the entire playoffs, as Thornton is a player who likes to move the plays south sometimes instead of moving it north like most players. He'll slow it down by bringing it back to his defense, and I feel like the Avalanche have begun to read that play, so he got punished for that a couple of times early on in this game. He did pick it up a bit as it went on, but still not that much. LeBanc had the puck a lot, but he couldn't get any shots through, as it seems as though the Avalanche have really closed in on him, and Sorensen was sort of just there. So the third line pretty ineffective, and the second line, and this is maybe the most concerning one, Hertl, Kane, and Radil have not really shown up at all in this series. I mean, yes, Kane has the goal in game 2, and Hertl had a couple points there, but I didn't even think they were like standouts in that second game. I thought they were okay in game 1, but I felt like they haven't really been huge parts at any point in this series, and that's especially concerning, as I said, for someone like Tomas Hertl, who was potentially the Sharks' MVP at forward at the very least during that first series against the Golden Knights, and he has yet to show up against a team who I thought he would be able to, be a huge part of the win against. Tomas Hertl is such a great player for the San Jose Sharks, and Evander Kane, he hasn't even been that apparent in these entire playoffs. He wasn't even, a forward MVP for the Sharks against the Golden Knights. He was okay in some of those games, and he's been half decent in some of them, but he's just not apparent enough, which is odd, because I feel like also Evander Kane would be a good player in these playoffs. He's maybe a bit more physical that you would like to see more in that Golden Knights series, which you did, but he also has a lot of speed. He also has some skill, and you'd think he'd be able to use that against the Avalanche, but it really hasn't worked out that way for whatever reason. Maybe it's because they have Radil on their line, and that's not really clicking. Radil has missed a couple of golden opportunities, including tonight. Kane passes to him on a 2-on-1, and Radil just completely fans on it. But I would want to see a lot more from both Kane and Hertl. Next is the power play. Now, of course, the Sharks did only get 1 and a bit power plays in this game. One that was cut off by the intermission, so they had the full 2 minutes. Another that was cut off by an Avalanche penalty or power play of their own. But I heard a lot of people complaining about the referees in this game, and were the referees quick to call some calls on the Sharks? Were they a bit too trigger happy there? But potentially, should they have called that penalty on Erik Karlsson as he was blatantly tripped at center ice while the Sharks were already on a power play, and it could have been a 5-on-3 and the Sharks could have gotten the first goal of the game and switched the whole momentum? Potentially as well, but were the referees the main reason why the Sharks lost this game, like how I felt they were in the game 2 of this series? I don't think so, honestly enough. This is why I could maybe look past the referees' involvement and maybe their subpar calling of this game, just because of the fact that the Sharks themselves didn't look like they really deserved to win. So while if the Sharks get that 5-on-3, maybe because of Jones's performance they managed to steal that game, but I feel like they didn't really deserve that. I feel like the Sharks didn't really put up a good enough performance for me to think that, for me to be upset. And so instead of being upset at the referees, which is something that, could very well be bad again, Game 5, Game 6, Game 7, the Sharks have no power over that, I will decide to be mad at the Sharks because they at least can improve their play. They are, in charge of how they play. They're not in charge about how the referees call a game. So I am a bit more disappointed in the Sharks. And while, the power play didn't get much opportunity to show anything, it has been a constant problem throughout this series. They have the one power play goal from Brent Burns in the dying seconds of Game 2. But otherwise, even through this entire playoffs, honestly enough, besides Game 7 against the Golden Knights, which was basically just the one major power play, because before that they were 0 for 4 in that game, they have been quite subpar. I think they're 5 for 45 on chances in these playoffs thus far, if you discount that major penalty, which is just unacceptable for the players that the Sharks do have. And I guess they're lucky that their penalty kill is performing at a pretty high level in this series thus far. The Avalanche also only have 2 power play goals to their name in this series tonight, Wilson, and then Game 1 also Colin Wilson, because otherwise the Sharks could be losing the special teams battle really hard right now. But it hasn't had too much of an effect on this series yet, but if it continues as such, and the Avalanche actually managed to start converting on their power play, the Sharks could be in deep trouble. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday for Game 5. They will be back in San Jose, but because of this loss in Game 4, they will be back in Colorado the game after that, whether or not they lose or win Game 5. But it's a best of 3 now that the series is tied at 2. The Sharks have the 2 home games if necessary, and so they are still in a solid position to win this series. They will just have to actually play at a much higher level than they were at in this game. Just get back to how they played in, let's say, Games 1 and 3, and potentially even 2, and they should have this series in the bag. Class dismissed.